I taught a class in this room for Wayne State, probably one of the finest historians that I had the privilege of considering a student and a colleague is Joel Stone. And I'm so delighted that Joel has the position of curator at the Detroit Historical Museum. He has a deep love for history. He has a passion for maritime history and is particularly interested in the Dawson and has done some outstanding work there. He also partnered with a history professor at Wayne State in an incredible student project that produced a book based on the papers written by, was it a dozen?
24.
24 history students at Wayne State who were doing primary research on little known stories, new stories related to the American Revolution. And I understand now you're working on the War of 1812?
It's on its way.
It's on its way. So would you please warmly welcome a good friend, an outstanding historian, and a terrific colleague, Mr. Joel Stone.
Yeah, geez, I don't know. I'm done after an introduction like that. I guess I gotta say that, yeah, last time I was here, I was sitting over there and learning how to run museums. And it's a hard game. And I got real lucky and got hired by the Detroit Historical Society. Luck, smarts, I don't know. Luck plays a large part in it. But in our organization, we've got people who do the curatorial. We've got people that deal with the public, that teach kids. And we've got people that deal with the PR. We've got people that deal with just running the day-to-day stuff, keeping the doors open. Right? She can do it all. She does a great job. And I'm really hoping, having watched the way things have gone with this organization, you guys have, if you're from Troy, you've got a heck of a resource here. Teaches kids, teaches adults, gives both of us a chance to get together and have fun. And I'm hoping that over time, the model that we've put together at the Detroit Historical Society works for you guys. I'm not sure that the model will exactly transfer, but 4 years ago, the Detroit Historical Society was asked by the city of Detroit to do the same thing. We can't afford a museum anymore. What do? Do we close the door? We figured out a way around it. Hopefully you guys can too. With that political statement, I'm going to move into my presentation. And I'm here as a representative of the Detroit Historical Society, and we handle the Detroit Historical Museum and the Dawson Museum, both of which are regional museums. And we celebrate the fact that there are town museums, Clawson, Troy, Birmingham, going west, Plymouth, going to the other side, Grosse Pointe, St. Clair Shores. Each of them have historical organizations, sometimes museums, sometimes just societies. And it's real nice to be the organization that helps draw all of those together. And that's what we do through both museums and through our collection and things we loan out, teamwork that we supply over time. And it's real nice to be here as a representative of that organization. And boy, do I have fun. She's right. I love boats. I really love boats. I'm a maritime guy. But I also really love early Detroit history, like right up through now. Okay? Detroit's gone through a lot of changes. And by looking at the past, we don't feel quite so bad about the future. Okay? We've gone through ups and downs many, many times. And I'll talk about that as we head through here. This is called, I went 5 minutes without changing a slide. That's against the rules, isn't it? I think so. We're looking at Detroit as the first city of the Old Northwest. And it really, really was. But what was the Old Northwest? What does it mean to be the first? There's always somebody that's going to argue with you about that. And what did we do with it? Where did it go? What has it taught us? Detroit, the little star down there. Thousands and millions and quadrillions of gallons of water above us, and all of it's heading out to the ocean. It made us a natural place to be. Going back to probably 800, maybe 1000 AD, the mound builders came up here, and they built mounds along the Detroit River. we've got one of them left, but there used to be hundreds. That was the culture that came up and retreated. The French, they came in, created a fur trading post, and we'll talk about that as we go on. A strategic location for the British military. This was ground zero for the western frontier in the Revolutionary War, and for the War of 1812, it was terribly important to us winning that battle. We were a center for early development of the lakes. Almost everything went by our shores. 800,000 gallons of water go by the Dawson Museum every minute. I mean, this is an important place to be, and it all comes there. Everything comes by our front door. A robust manufacturing history we had, diverse cultural history we enjoy, we celebrate, we hope. Sometimes not always, but we really try. And I like to think we're at the forefront of urban regeneration. Things have gotten bad in towns all over the country. And we tend to look to Detroit and say things are worse here, but they're not. They're bad all over. We're just at the forefront. We're the guys reinventing the game. And hopefully we get a chance to do it right. As far as who was first, we weren't the first. They came in, the Canadians came in through, the French in fact, came in through French River. It was much easier for them to come up through Lake Nipissing than it was for them to go south through the route that we would think would make more sense, through Lake Erie and Lake Ontario and out to Montreal. Except that down in the corner there was Iroquois country. And the French didn't get along with the Iroquois. The Iroquois were very closely allied with the English, so that was kind of off limits. Above that, there was the Huron. And the Huron, they were an Iroquoian nation, but they didn't get along with the Iroquois, the six nations of the Iroquois. So that was kind of a neutral land. And then following over that, there were several different groups, and they all tended to move around. We had the Huron also wrapped down into kind of what we now is Lower Ontario. We had the Ojibwe. The Ojibwe were tucked kind of up into the Georgian Bay Peninsula, and kind of around the Saginaw Bay area with the Fox. All of this changed over time. I mean, we mentioned that now in 1610, but eventually the Fox ended over in Green Bay, and the Ojibwe ended up more in the Upper Peninsula. And the Potawatomi, who were wrapped to the north, came to the south. So it's real hard to talk about that, but it's real easy to say that they came in through the north because the Sioux, or because the Iroquois were there. They developed different relationships. It was mostly the missionaries and the explorers that came in. The missionaries came in first to St. Mary's of the Huron over in Georgia, or in Georgian Bay there. And then there was a settlement set up over in Green Bay. And then they kind of stopped in the middle up at Sault Ste. Marie. They stopped up at St. Ignace, and that actually was probably the most permanent of the settlements. And we're talking small little settlements. This is where the missionary would come in and they would establish a small church. And a trader would follow along, and he would start trading with them. And in this case, it was Père Marquette. Marquette eventually worked with Nicolette down. They were looking for the Mississippi. They did touch base down in Chicago, and then they moved on. But they left these small little places around. And again, these were traders who were coming through. They were looking for furs. Furs were the currency of the day. The word buck, I mean, we talk about $1, it's a buck, came from the furs. And along with them came two different groups of priests, the Recollets, or Franciscans, who came in first, and not all of them survived. The Jesuits came afterwards, and there was all kinds of excitement, especially with Cadillac. Cadillac was named the head of the trading post up at Michilimackinac. And Michilimackinac at this time was a region. It wasn't, we talk about it, that little fort just before you get on the Mackinac Bridge and go over the top. But Michilimackinac covered basically that whole area, St. Ignace, what we now call Mackinac City, and areas on both sides. And there was a trading post there where the French were collecting furs and shipping them the northern route back to Montreal. And the English were slowly starting to come in. They'd come out of New York with the Dutch traders, and they worked their way to Albany, and they were starting to infiltrate into what we now call Ohio and New York, up in New York. And Cadillac looked at that and he said, we need to stop this, and the best place to do that is to stop it at Detroit. And he went back from Michilimackinac to France, and that must have been quite a bit of culture shock. And he stepped in and convinced the king that that was the place to do it. Now, interestingly enough, there was also another group in Montreal that was trying to get trading rights. And their petition was also before the king, and in fact, their petition was approved by the king. Cadillac and his buddies, and one of his buddies was Pontchartrain, one of Louis' chamberlains, said, you know, if you guys wait at all, you're going to lose this game. So Cadillac and his guys, and most of the people in Montreal who had the chance to trade, sent a contingent to Detroit before the other organization could get their roots in there. So Cadillac from the beginning was kind of a scoundrel, and history I think will prove that out. He came in and he settled in Detroit. Oops, here we go. In 1701. He brought most of what was going on up at Michilimackinac down to Detroit, and he set up a trading post there and also started inviting the Native Americans to join him. So he asked all of the local tribes around the Great Lakes to set up housekeeping in the neighborhood of the fort, and 3 of the tribes did that. The Ojibwe came down, the Chippewa came down, or I'm sorry, the Potawatomi came down, and the Hurons came down, which is kind of interesting. The Hurons ended up on the Canadian side. The Potawatomi were kind of where Fort Wayne is now, and then the Ojibwe ended up in Sandwich near Peach Island. So they kind of separated from each other, established very strong forts or trading areas. This is Cadillac's, and Cadillac had approximately 200, 250 people, whereas the Native American towns were more in the neighborhood of 1,000, depending on the time of year, whether they were out hunting or they were farming. This is what Cadillac did. You can see the very beginnings. St. Anne's Church is up on St. Anne's Street, up in the upper corner there. Right in front of that was the barn. In the middle, you can see kind of a communal oven. Cadillac's house was the one closest to the water, just above the center there. And then the other folks kind of had their properties. Many of the folks that came with him were artisans, French artisans, who for one reason or another found themselves in Quebec or Montreal as opposed to in France. And they came with him. He brought about 150 soldiers initially. Most of them went home. The artisans stayed and became farmers, because it's about the only thing they had. And some of them lived in the fort, some of them lived up and down, and they eventually developed this area. As far as who was first, we still win in first permanent settlements. You can see that things again developed up at Sioux and over in Green Bay. Little by little, other areas established permanent settlements. When we discuss the Old Northwest, this would have been just after the Revolution. So that we've established, this is just after the French-Indian War. So we've established that the English are essentially in the red area over here. And the line drawn down there is the King of England, George III, established that you really shouldn't settle the other side of that. It was kind of a no man's land. And beyond that was the Canadian territory. Everything in white is eventually what we talk about as the Old Northwest, which includes Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, parts of Minnesota, and of course way up into the northern Ontario. And over time, this got broken up. But Detroit itself was the center of the whole thing. Once you left Otsego, or once you left Buffalo and you headed off, you were basically stepping off into the full wilderness, and Detroit was the first thing you would see other than Indian villages before you got here. And once you left Detroit and went north, you were pretty much on your own. You can see that there were French farms kind of laid out in the area around the fort, north of Belle Isle. In the area south of that, on the Canadian side, it was known as the Petite Côte, the small coast. And Detroit arguably had the first suburbs of any of the other towns on the Great Lakes, and that would have been it. At this point, Detroit is not, Detroit in Canada. The Detroit River is not a border. The Detroit River is the main street. And when people got to the Detroit River, they were able to find very luscious farming lands. There was lots and lots of trapping going on. The hunting was very good. And it was a wonderful spot to have a habitation grow. And eventually the French were able to build it up. This is Fort Detroit, 40 years after we saw the last picture, about 10 years before the British arrived. And we've got more buildings, we have more streets, they've actually established a fort. And when I say a fort, it was a palisade, logs standing upright, but a fairly sizable town and fairly sizable buildings. There was a lot of trade going on here, and it was the focus for many things. Part of that was caused by the Revolution. The British came in 1760. They had essentially won the French and Indian War, and they moved in and took over. They only brought with them about 300 people, about 100 traders and about 200 troops and supernumeraries, and they moved in and took over the town. Everything around was essentially a French settlement. Everything on the other side of the river was a French settlement. And it was only during the Revolution that they really expanded the fort, that they really solidified it. They built a citadel. They reinforced it with about 500 troops. And Detroit became the center for much of the Indian raids that went into Ohio. Detroit became the center still for the fur trade that was coming down. Of course, with troops now in Detroit, reinforced in Mackinac, reinforced at Green Bay. The traders were doing a lot more business selling things to the British than they were actually taking in furs and shipping them to either Montreal or Albany. So that became a very important part of the business, and Detroit during the Revolutionary War was very much a British city, a British town. Loyalists, it wasn't a question of loyalists versus revolutionaries. That word never got here. It was a garrison. We needed the soldiers. We didn't care if they, were here. All of the supplies came in through Montreal. We needed that. There was a thing on the East Coast which was interesting during the Revolution. We don't think about it, but the folks on the East Coast really preferred being English. Before the Revolutionary War started, we really, really wanted to stay English. We liked it. We bought our stuff from them. That was our law system. We were very, very closely tied to England. When that finally broke, of course, there was all kind of propaganda. None of the propaganda reached here. And Detroit basically made their own stuff or brought it in through Montreal. We didn't enjoy the baubles of Britain that everybody else did. So we really didn't have anything to do with the Revolution, except that we were a place where prisoners were brought. Detroit's population swelled during the Revolution because prisoners were brought from all over. Some of them treated very well. I mean, they were actually given credit by the local merchants. They enjoyed trading. They had free reign. Some of them were put in cells and kept for a long time. The stories that are interesting, and in fact they're in the book, which thank you for giving the plug there. We'll be selling them afterwards. But the stories that are interesting as to how the trade went through the Revolution. Here's a picture that's actually drawn just before the Americans arrived. And before the Americans arrived, they had built a fort. They called it Fort Renewal. The stockade didn't prove to be enough. They convinced them that the Americans were going to come. We built a big fort downtown. When the Americans took it over, it was called Fort Shelby, after the Kentucky governor. And if downtown you're looking for where Fort Shelby was, go to Fort Shelby, and you're going to find it right there. You can see that the town has started to develop, and this is about the point where the Americans come in, and they suffer for a few years. It doesn't grow. First thing it does is it burns down. 1805, we had a huge fire, completely leveled the town itself. The fort survived. All of the French farms that were up and down the river survived. Those did very well. There were no loss of lives, and only 2 people that suffered minor injuries. So as far as a devastating fire, it wasn't bad. And it also brought the local communities together. What is now Windsor, Sandwich, Walkerville, all sent things. The fort down in Malden, who was our enemies, they sent help. Local communities sent a lot of things to help the Americans. The best part that happened here was that it leveled an old town, a very small town, a very compact town, and it allowed us to build a town with big wide boulevards and a town on a new style. And that came over time. During this period, different of the towns around the Great Lakes incorporated. In 1805, we had our fire. 1805 was also when the first American government arrived. General Hull and Augustus Woodward arrived to be the first, and it really was the first government. It's the first time we had courts in Detroit. Before that, courts were in Montreal. They briefly set up a court of Hesse while we were in American territory that was run by the British. The British were actually running our court system for a while because we didn't have one. 1806, we brought one in. And little by little, the rest of the Great Lakes filled in. Detroit was the center of where things were happening. Of course, we were dealing with kind of an old-time system, the old ribbon farms that the French had developed. And it was a great idea. Everybody had a long, thin farm, and everybody had a piece of the water, because transportation was water at this point. There were very, very few roads, and the roads there were didn't lead very far, and they were very bad. So that the river formed the transportation. Just for an example, as far as scale goes, you can see just above the word river there is where the fort was. And then there are the ribbon farms that go back on either side, the Brush to the right and the Cass farm to the left. And they kind of top out where Marquette Street and Milwaukee Street are, just south of the General Motors building. Then there's a big square up there, which is land that the government gave us to sell to try to raise money, called the 10,000 acres tract. And that's kind of where the General Motors building is up to the Boston Edison district. But Detroit was essentially chopped up into these long ribbon farms, and that's how many people, and our culture developed along that. You see the houses that are noted as you go up and down the coast. So for the first few years, we started in 1806, we grew a little bit as far as a town. This is up through 1837. 1837 we become a state. You can see that they bought a couple of big farms. The light blue one there, I think was the Bobian farm, and then the purple one would have been the Brush farm, which was a property of John Aston when he gave to his brother, his son-in-law. The green area was known as the Parklands. It was something that Jefferson set up, and it essentially takes up the place where Orchestra Hall is, running through the New Center area, just about to where our museum is. Below that, the blue, that was the Cass farm. Lewis Cass had bought a lot of property, and he kept it. The next farm over there that wasn't bought, DeGarmo Jones, he wasn't sure he wanted to sell yet, and then they bought from several other landowners, and that's what Detroit looked like in 1937 when we hit statehood. I mentioned that after the fire, they tried to redesign the city. Judge Woodward, Augustus Woodward, was our first Supreme Court justice, and he was I suppose loosely a student of Thomas Jefferson's, a student of L'Enfant's, who laid out Washington, D.C., and he carried L'Enfant's plan for Washington, D.C. around in his diary. And so when it came the chance to completely rebuild a city that had been burned, this is what he came up with. It was kind of a series of hexagons and lots of alleys and lots of places where people could, pass through, and looked a lot like Paris, looked a lot like parts of Washington were planned. And he thought it was a great idea. Nobody else did, though. They came up with some variations on the theme. They modified the plan going forward. And by 1824, Woodward is gone. Woodward has left town. Nobody liked him. They gave him a very fond send-off and sent him down to Florida. And at that point, they had to deal with what he had designed and what was the reality. You'll notice that down near the river, the south end there, the guys who had property in Detroit, they rebuilt it. They said, we're not waiting for this Woodward plan to happen. We're setting it up in squares, just like we were used to. And they established that going up. And so the people who came in said, well, you know what, let's leave the squares near the bottom and we'll kind of develop the Woodward thing and let's see what happens. And they did that for a while, and finally Lewis Cass came in. Lewis Cass and Augustus Woodward didn't get along so well. They both respected each other, but Cass said, you know, this is stupid. Let's go with the squares. We'll put in some nice little boulevards, partly because we already had them. We've got Michigan Avenue kind of coming in on the angle there, and you can see where Campus Martius is, kind of by the Compass Rose. And that was there because that was already an Indian road. That already led off, you know, in the neighborhood of Chicago. That already went that way. Then there was another one that kind of went off to the top, and we call it Grand River now, but it headed toward Grand Rapids. And the main line running up the center, which got called Woodward, oddly enough, he claimed it was because it ran toward the woods. Everybody else knew better. That was on its way to Pontiac. And there was another road off to the side called Gratiot, because it was going to Fort Gratiot. So a lot of the bones were already there, you know, and the city was bounded by the Cass farm on one side, the Brush farm on the other, and these guys just kind of made it real. And this is what we're looking at today. This is the way Detroit is laid out. If you look at it from the top, we've got Washington Boulevard. We call it Washington Avenue. Came down to Wayne Street. We now call that Washington Avenue. And most of these have remained the same. Miami became Broadway, but essentially Detroit was settled and set by 1834. We've established ourselves as a city, and it started to look like a city. We had streets laid out. Again, you can see that line running off that now we call Michigan Avenue off to the back. Campus Martius was an area that was open. It was an area that, you know, troops could get together and drill. We had a fort in the way. The fort went away by 1920 or by 1826. They finally decommissioned it and took it apart. But Detroit's established itself. Cass is living up just outside the stockade. We have several houses that are actually looking like residential areas. There's kind of a square building there that was Woodward's Hotel, which was called the Steamboat Hotel because he opened it the year that the first steamboat arrived in Detroit in 1818. And the Walk on the Water kind of changed the world here. It ran between Buffalo and Detroit, and it opened things up. In 1825, the Erie Canal opened. And this was our first boom period. The Erie Canal opened, and people came in by the thousands. And they came by steamboat, because it was still water. It was the only way to get here. An interesting view of the Walk on the Water. It was really much flatter boat, but you see the growth of the city there as it happens. And not too many years later, it's looking like this. The growth of the Erie Canal and the opening of Michigan Territory. The Michigan Territory had a terrible reputation to start with, and then over time people said, no, this is really good farming. This is a wonderful place to live, and they started coming in and they grew rapidly. This is a rather fanciful version. I think they took all of the boats within 2 days and kind of put them in the picture and made it very pretty. A more realistic picture of what Detroit looked like is probably this. But you still see that they've now got a ferry between Detroit and Windsor, because of course now it's a border. Okay, Windsor being the Canadian, or Sandwich being the Canadian town, and Detroit. And they're starting to run regular steam ferries or steam ships between Buffalo and Detroit constantly. You know, we've now starting to get the looks of a real town and a real city. You can see that we've got the spires of an Episcopal and a Presbyterian church, the double spires, kind of skewed in an unusual way for St. Anne's. I think this next one will give it better. DeGarmo Jones finally sold his farm, and we bought a little bit of stuff to the east, which is now kind of where Eastern Market is, St. Joe's Church, down the Shane farm. And Detroit's looking like a real town. And this is 1835. Chicago is just getting started. Chicago's getting chartered in this year. They're just getting, and they're flooding. Chicago flooded horribly. You know, so it hasn't started growing. Now, if any of you are from Chicago, I'll automatically say that within 15 years of this picture, Chicago took off. Okay, the railroads came in, the railroads started running, and they really kind of shifted the whole balance of power from Detroit to Chicago. But that didn't put Detroit out of the game. Soon after this, I I gotta mention it, 1837, there it is. You know, things are looking pretty good. Detroit's building. It's got lots of substantial buildings, and they're selling land like crazy. And they're selling it at incredible prices. They can't even believe it. A bunch of guys, real smart guys, Trowbridge and Woodbridge, got together and they bought the Cass farm from him and paid him a huge amount of money. He's now a senator in Washington. And then we had a year like 2 years ago. 1837, the bottom fell out of the real estate market. And everything went bust. Even the Trowbridge and the Woodbridges, they lost all their money. They forfeited the land back to Cass. But Detroit didn't stop. It kept going. It kept growing. This is Campus Martius. The day after Abraham Lincoln was shot, there was a gathering. And you can see Woodward would be running on kind of the one side of the picture. The state capitol is the tower in the background there, which used to sit in Capitol Park. If you're down there, it's Griswold and State Street. You can still visit it. And this has been a gathering place for Detroiters for years. It was a place, I mean, we talked about it as Campus Martius. It was a place where the troops drilled. It was a place where they got together after the telegraph had gone in and told them that Lincoln died. And it's a place where we eventually built the city hall. And this is just 6 years after that last picture. And all of a sudden, we've got this gorgeous city hall. The old city hall sits across the way. This is kind of the first set of growing pains. You know, not too long ago, we had completely collapsed, yet Detroit is now rebuilding itself. And, you know, we've gone from the old city hall and the wooden buildings to now what's about to be a really big city. And if you're talking about the first half of Detroit's history, that's probably where it ends. Okay, about just after the Civil War. The Civil War really helped, like all wars do, they kick things up. And this is where Detroit changed gears. All right, the city between there and 1900 kicked out a little bit and enclosed a whole lot more territory, almost doubled in size. And for those of you who are old Detroiters, if you start over at Belle Isle between the yellow and the green there, that line is Outer Drive, or I'm sorry, it is Grand Boulevard. And at Grand Boulevard runs around and across and back down and ends up over near Fort Wayne. And, you know, that was a great idea. You know, put a street around the town that you could deal with. And then they started again, and you've got Van Dyke running up. The upper yellow is kind of kicking up into the Boston Edison district and is really developing the city. But most of what we're talking about is happening down along the river. Here's another picture just 4 years later after the other one. You know, now we got brick buildings instead of wooden buildings. We've got buildings that are 4 stories tall instead of 2 stories tall. You can see there's a sign off to the side where it says Detroit Stoves. That's a teller because that's one of the things that really kicked in for Detroit. But we've also got scales and trucks. Scales are something Detroiters don't realize. We were huge in scales because we had great casting. And there's all kinds of hats and caps and furs, and a lot of that stuff was made here. Not of it was brought in, but a lot of it was made here. Streets like Cass Avenue. Who would have believed Cass Avenue looked like this? Okay, but it did. And churches. We had churches, and they're gorgeous, and then many of them are still available to see. Not too long after that, 1890, City Hall's not dwarfing everything. The city's kind of growing up around it. I always like, you guys are going to know this more than most people. You know, when I give this pitch to kids, they have no idea. If you go by the asterisk, go down the asterisk, everything that's got an asterisk, we were the biggest and the best. Okay, we had the biggest facility or you know, did the most of it. You know, steel. We got into steel real early. Rail cars. We were making rail cars before anybody else was. You know, the refrigerator car basically invented here. The Pullman organization. You know, the car was invented here. We sold it to Pullman. He put his name on it and moved it to Indiana. Iron stoves. We were by far the biggest seller of stoves in the world. Brass and copper rolling, wire and wire screening, shipbuilding. We're talking iron here. Detroit was making iron. But they were also making other things. You know, they were inventing things like adding machines. They were developing the scales. Remember when you used to get the meat from the grocer, and you put it on the scale, and a little wheel would go, and he'd go across the side, and he'd write the number down. You know, that was before electronics. That was a computing scale. It was invented in Detroit, moved down to Toledo. We've all heard of the Toledo scales, but it started up here. You know, vacuum cleaners, we didn't invent them, but we did have Eureka, huge company. Color postcards. We probably made more color postcards than any place else in the country. And sheet music. There were times Remick and Irving Berlin sheet music were balancing each other. Who was best in the world? And they were doing that. The DNC line, Burroughs, Kresge, I mean, these are all based in Detroit. And, you know, and it just keeps going. Lumber and pharmaceuticals. We had not only Park Davis, but Stearns and Scherer were huge pharmaceutical manufacturers, figuring out ways to make pharmaceuticals easy to take. You know, they had the same dosage, and they came in a nice pill. You know, this was developed in Detroit. Packaging was a big deal. We get down to, I think it must have been on the last one, but we get down to seeds. You know, Ferry didn't invent seeds. Ferry figured out a way to put them on your counter, and he did it very well. Paints and varnishes, we made lots of. Marine motors, we got into speedboats. Soda ash, which, ask anybody what soda ash goes into. I didn't know, I shook my head. It goes into darn near everything, especially things like cement and steel. We made more cigars than anybody else in the country. You know, we'd grow the wrappers. Wrappers were grown in Ontario. They'd come to us, the tobacco would come up from the south, and we rolled more than that. And we had the world's busiest waterway for many, many years. Some iconic stuff, things that happened accidentally. You know, James Verner, who developed the ginger ale we all love, it was an accident. You know, he was experimenting with a couple of things. He put them in a barrel, and went away to the Civil War, came back, and everything was, and he took off from there. He was a pharmacist. He got out of pharmacy. He started selling pot. It was a wonderful thing. And because we were based on the water, and I keep coming back to the water, but that's how people enjoy themselves. They take a ferry boat up to Belle Isle. They take a ferry boat just darn near anywhere. You know, Belle Isle was one of the prettiest parks in the country. It was designed partially by Olmsted, who designed the Columbian Fair, who designed Central Park. And, you know, it was just a nice place to go. There was always something happening. 1,000 people would go there on a hot summer night. And they'd often set up tents, spend the night, have a barbecue. It's a wonderful thing. They still do it. I always loved this picture. Ladies just enjoying themselves, and the kid in the corner just adds, not quite sure what he's doing, but I can tell he's having fun. And this is the other end of Belle Isle, up by the Belle Isle Light, and, you know, ships going by every 30 seconds. A ship passed the Belle Isle Light. Busiest waterway in the world. Part of it was due to our time we spent with passenger boats. You know, there were a couple of passenger fleets on Lake Michigan, you know, that operated between the resorts in Michigan and Chicago, the resorts in Michigan and Milwaukee. But most of the passenger traffic was based in Detroit. Whether it was the White Star Line, the DNC Line, the Northern Navigation, what they call the Georgian Bay Line, which was the Chicago, Duluth, and Georgian Bay Line. They were all based in Detroit, and we did more passengers than any place else. Some of them were local. Tasman would head up St. Clair River and stop at Joe Bedore's and a dozen other places that were set up just for a great Sunday afternoon. Sometimes a picnic, sometimes a card game, you know, depending on where you got off, but you could do that all the time. And then, of course, there was Pablo, which was started essentially as a picnic island and turned into an amusement park that most of us remember, hopefully happily. Detroit made more ships for the Great Lakes trade than any other place in the country. You know, there were several other ship manufacturers, and they all ended up merging at one time, but Detroit had two of the biggest and several of the smaller ones, including a lot of the smaller entertainment, the recreational big boats. Chris Craft and Sea Ray and Hacker and Garwood, you know, all of these recreational crafts were built at Gregory Marine, turned out lots of boats. Fisher, we built a lot of boats, big and small. And we had a waterfront that showed it. It was a lot of big shops, a lot of small shops, and a whole lot of smokestacks. And It's interesting when kids talk about industry today, and we talk about the waterfront, and so much of that has disappeared. And if you, I don't think I have the picture right there, but if you look at it, Detroit used to be spread out along the river. And most of the industry was there, and it started moving out. This is what Detroit looked like before the First World War. It expanded just a little bit. It kind of developed down toward River Rouge and into the Delray community, and expanded north toward Grosse Pointe and picked up that little blue stuff up there. But then after World War I, Detroit just exploded. Between 1918 and 1925, 7 years, and this is where the rest of the city ended up. And that's the size that we've got now, 139.8 square miles. And it's interesting to see what they're discussing doing with it, because there used to be 2 million people. 1950, there were about 2 million people, and now there's under 1 million people. And you know, this is what history. This is what makes history fun, is watching where it's going. But during the 1910s, 1920s, Detroit was the fastest growing city in the country. You know, we'd gone kind of out of the Civil War era, and we developed into a manufacturing center that did cigars, that did pharmaceuticals, that did iron, that did railroad cars, that did all of these different things, carriages, and then the automobile took off. And once the automobile took off, so did Detroit. You know, we put in more schools, churches, electric wiring, plumbing, public lighting than any other place in the country. More residences of all kinds. The buildings, you know, the major buildings that we still count on today were built in the 1920s. The bridges, both bridges, biggest theater district, more seats in theaters than any place else in the country, and of course a huge manufacturing base. Here's a picture of 1955, and there's not a building in there that wasn't constructed before 1930. I mean, all of the tall buildings, all of the small, the beautiful hotels, all were constructed mostly in 1920 and 1930. Biggest Masonic temple in the world, biggest unused railroad station. I do like to point out that they never did finish the railroad station. It was a great idea. They didn't put any parking around it because everybody went by streetcar. Pretty soon nobody went by streetcar. They were all going by cars, and then pretty much lined things up. But the Detroit Institute of Arts got a beautiful new building. The Detroit Public Library got a beautiful new building. We built a tunnel and a bridge. Besides this, there was a railroad tunnel that had gone in previously. So we actually had several tunnels, and we were still running railroad cars. And then by the mid-1930s, Henry Ford had built the biggest industrial plant in the world, all along the Detroit River. And again, I point out to kids the smokestacks. You know, there was a lot going on along that riverfront, and we weren't looking at using it for recreation. You know, you can see the freighters that are parked there. Belle Isle was for recreation, and the riverfront was for work. And this is something that you could have seen in 1974. I mean, this didn't change that recently. The Lansdowne and many of those railroad ferries were run until 1974, and this has just barely started to change. They fixed kind of downtown and north. They're slowly recovering what's downtown and south. We built some beautiful buildings, had some great architects and great architecture. I mean, this is a drugstore. Compare this to a CVS. You know, we had some gorgeous buildings. Downtown was lively, but you can still see a dichotomy here. Up front, we've got Civil War era buildings, 1860, 1870, you know, tucking right up to high rises. And these things needed to change, and they eventually did change. You know, things get torn down. I talked about City Hall earlier. City Hall is now dwarfed, and that wasn't soon to stay. Great picture of Hudson's back when we used to have streetcars. Verner's was no longer down near the water. Verner's was now where Wayne State University is, and this building's gone. Now there's a beautiful dormitory with shops in it. So we've actually changed from the waterfront to this, to where it's now owned by Switzerland Company, I think. We started putting in freeways, which moved people around very well, but freeways needed room to roam. We started doing urban renewal, and urban renewal took out a lot of neighborhoods. This is the area kind of to the east of Detroit, where we tried a major experiment, where we took out huge swaths of land and we put in some real nice buildings. Miles Vanderoe came in, and he helped us develop this whole series, this utopian series of high-rises and lots of park space. And I gotta say, this is an experiment that a lot of people poo-pooed, and it still seems to be doing very well. It's well occupied, and there's a lot of park space, but it still took out a neighborhood. We started having buildings that were on the outskirts of town, not close enough to the suburbs, not close enough to downtown, and we know what happened to Tiger Stadium. We used to be the biggest provider of passenger ships, and little by the 1960s, the passenger ships had gone. People had taken to cars. And being the car capital of the world, I suppose we can't hold that against us. But this was disappearing from the waterfront. You can see the Robin Hood Flower and the Rickle elevators there. All of that stuff was being taken away from the waterfront and moved back. Waterfront property wasn't quite as valuable, and trains did a lot of work that the waterfront didn't. We did build some nice new buildings. We put up the city-county building in '55, which, I love this next picture, was counterposed by the junk wagons that were still horse-pulled. Same era. I mean, we're talking about this new architecture, and yet we're still kind of living in the past. There were things, I mean, Detroit has evolved gradually in all cases. And, we got this great Noguchi building, or rather, Yamasaki building that went up and helped develop Hart Plaza, helped redefine downtown Detroit. And it's an interesting comparison between the Yamasaki building and the Guardian building there that was, so spectacular and so 1920s. It's an interesting counterbalance. And of course, then we got the Renaissance Center in the 80s, and that really defined our skyline. From the skyline I showed you in 1955 to the skyline that we've got today, much has changed. We've gone through lots of ups and downs. Detroit has changed many, many times. We saw it in the early days, with the fur trade going away, then something else came in. We had the land boom and bust of 1837. We had depressions that happened, and fires that happened, and all of it, we've been able to survive, little by little. We've come back. And this is a great story to tell. This is where I put in my plug for the organization. This is a story we tell constantly. Every one of these little pieces, every one of those slides could have been its own presentation. Every one of those slides could have been its own exhibit. And we enjoy changing these things out and having them available for people to see. Of course, we run the Detroit Historical and the Dawson Museum. Most people remember this, the streets of Old Detroit. Been there since 1951, and hasn't changed much at all. We've updated it a little bit, but haven't gone to holograms yet. Might happen soon, we'll see. And then, of course, over at the Dawson, we've got the spectacular Gothic room from the city of Detroit 3, telling the story of the great steamers that worked the Great Lakes. This being the men's smoking room from the city of Detroit, but we've also got the pilot house from the William Clay Ford. We've also got the periscope from the Tambor. We use honest, real artifacts to tell the story. And it's a story I love telling, if you guys can't tell. It's 300 years and more of wonderful history. And I love the first 150 years, but the next 150 and the 150 after that is just about as good. Did anybody have any questions?
Kaiser Fraser built ships during World War II. Was he building those in the Detroit area?
Nope, he was building those out in Seattle. Yep. He came here and spent a little bit of time, but he took his money pretty quickly to the West Coast. And that was something that we don't talk about much about Detroit history. Why did Detroit change so much? When Detroit was developing as the first city, there was a lot of money coming here. There was was no place else to send it. There wasn't much going on in St. Louis. There wasn't much going on in Seattle or in California, or for that matter, in Nashville or down in Georgia. But over time, as those areas developed, when capital was looking to develop, and we're talking about the Ford Motor Company and GM too, they would take and they would put plants down there. Little by little, the money in Detroit got dispersed, and the money that was coming in from, the East Coast, the big money houses, had other places to look. There were other places they could build an airplane plant in the middle of Nebraska, which in the 1870s they wouldn't have thought of doing. In the 1890s, 1910s, once trucks kicked in and things, they could transfer things, then they started moving their money out. So that's kind of why Fraser ended up Boeing. Boeing was here in Detroit building airplanes before he went to Seattle. So we have a claim to a lot of those things. We almost got into the airplane business really big, but that's a whole other story.
Any other questions? Joel, thank you so much.
No.